There's a quote that's doing the rounds right now from the actor and comedian Rowan Atkinson. Now, when it comes to quotes, I always try to use a little bit of caution. It's attributed to him. Um, I will say I think it's very plausible. It's the sort of thing he would say because this is his record on the subject. So I'm just going to read out the quote, and it's this. I should say the source is someone called Yarenz Soriano. That's Jarenz Soriano from Facebook, he's posted this quote. Comedy should be a means of exposing and ridiculing the follies, foibles, and failings of mankind. That's what it's for. It should have no taboos. The job of comedy is to offend. If there's no offence, then there's probably little true comedy. Now, I've seen interviews with Atkinson where he has spoken out against PC culture and as he sees it, the culture of being offended too easily. So that very much, I think the quote is probably accurate. I mean, accurately attributed. If it is slightly different or there's any, different slant on it, then I take responsibility for this video. But I want to break that down a little bit because I don't agree. Or rather, I think it's not as, on the surface, people might think, it's great, he's standing up to woke sensibilities and so on. Well, there's an obvious thing. The job of comedy is to offend. I thought the job of comedy was to make people laugh. Surely that's the most important thing. And I will say this, a caveat before I get into this. I've no doubt some people will come to this video and say I have no sense of humour. That's the angle that they'll take. I find many things funny. I actually find Rowan Atkinson funny. I quite like a lot of his work. I like Mr. Bean, for example. It had a sort of that's the irony. Actually, his own brand of comedy is relatively tame. It's not particularly risque. So it's kind of ironic that he's the one pushing this message. He's not a Roy Chubby Brown, for example. He's not that sort of gratuitously offensive type. It's interesting though because John Cleese has had similar statements in recent years. To be honest, I think John Cleese is sounding a bit, again, funny man, genuinely funny man, but there is an element of this that sort of sounds like, oh, in my day, these guys are in their 70s, 80s now, they're getting older, and it sort of feels like a bit of back in my day, that sort of frankly whinging. An issue I take with this sort of angle is that it gets into the free speech domain, right? So comedians like Rowan Atkinson will say it's all about free speech. He hasn't mentioned that in this particular quote. That's the angle that I've seen him take in other areas. And yeah, they have free speech, but you know what? Part of free speech is the right for others to criticise. And an expression I really, really don't like is just have a sense of humour, because humour is subjective. Okay, what one person finds funny, other people don't. Now, I mentioned I have a particular type of humour. I do quite like Rowan Atkinson stuff, not all of it. I like Being the movie a lot. I think it's a very funny film. Some of his other stuff, Johnny English, I think was slightly overrated. It was all right, but I think Being the movie was hilarious. I like Friends. I like Big Bang Theory. I like some traditional British comedy like Steptoe and Son, Faulty Towers for that matter. I like some of Family Guy. For me, Family Guy is hit and miss. Some of it's witty and funny. Some of it's just offensive for the sake of being offensive, as opposed to being particularly smart. Because I do think there is a difference. Now, Atkinson makes a point regarding humour being used as a tool to poke fun at mankind's foibles. I get that. In fact, there's a rich history of that with the history of satire. And that has a long history in this country. It was particularly popular in the 18th century when cartoonists could openly mock the king and, if not get away with it, certainly not risk any major repercussions, certainly not in the way they would in France, for example. So satire has a long, rich part of our culture. It's part of our democracy. National newspapers, even the serious ones, always have mocking satirical cartoons. I do think there's a place for that because it's a way of poking critique at the powerful. So I think there is a place for it. Um, but I do take issue with that statement. Comedy should be about offending. No, it should be about making people laugh. Because if you have a comedian who's just trying to be offensive, then it says to me they're actually quite lazy because it's the only material they have. Like, they can't really come up with anything that's just genuinely funny. It's almost like shock for shock's sake. That isn't particularly witty or funny. I'm not even talking about the offence part. I just don't think it's particularly good work. It's lazy. Um, and Atkinson says if there's no offence, then there's probably little true comedy. Well, that's his opinion. He's a successful comedian and actor, but others would disagree. Now, I appreciate that in the 21st century, a very tame, straight sort of humour probably just wouldn't be that popular. So I accept and agree that a certain edge to humour definitely has a place. But here's the challenge I would make for this argument. Is Atkinson and others who come out with this argument really saying that if you get, say, a stand-up comedian and they use some human tragedy, say a train crash or a terrorist attack, and they explicitly mock the victims and, use that for their punchlines, are they seriously saying the people involved in that should just laugh it off and be okay with it? If someone close to me had died in that sort of situation, I wouldn't be saying, oh no, it's just comedy, whatever. I'd be pretty pissed off. So I think it's a bit arrogant to say, oh, you must find it funny, or even if you don't find it funny, it's just you have no right to complain about it. We have free speech. So if comedians have the freedom of expression to make tasteless jokes, then others have the freedom of expression to say, no, that's in bad taste. Because there's this knee-jerk reaction that comedians often have, which is if they're criticised, oh, you're censoring me, you're trying to shut me down. I think comedians who constantly complain need to learn the difference between being criticised and being censored. There is a difference. Now, if a comedian starts losing shows and gets cancelled on networks and so, that might be a different matter. But I think actually the angle is that they can't handle criticism, basically. So they're saying it's okay for us to be offensive because it's comedy, but it's not okay for people to criticise us. Oh no, they're trying to silence us. They have no sense of humour. You can't have it both ways. So frankly, I think Atkinson's attitude's a little bit arrogant. Again, if that quote is accurate. I would never advocate, shutting comedians down unless it is gratuitously going out of their way to hurt people. For example, if you have some comedian who would actually go out of their way to name individuals, I'm not talking about famous individuals, but private individuals, and actually use them as a punchline, then I think it's just bullying. It's just harassment and bullying to actually try and hurt someone that way. It is true that there's not going to be much humour that isn't perhaps offensive to someone. I agree with that. But what I disagree with is this idea that there can be no criticism, that only comedians can have a voice, and anyone who criticises them is somehow censoring it. Or, frankly, comedians need to get over themselves. I'm talking about the comedians who constantly complain. Okay, you want to be offensive, you want to make provocative acts, fine. But just don't complain when people have an issue with it. They have a right to have an issue with it. It's not the same as censoring you or silencing you. Let me know your thoughts. I just think it's a bit arrogant, the angle that Atkinson has taken with this, and he's not the only one. John Cleese and others as well. And of course they get a lot of support. People lap it up and say, oh, they're absolutely right, have a sense of humour. But again, humour is subjective. You cannot dictate that people, it's not that they're saying find it funny, but they are saying have a sense of humour, or another one they'll come out with is if you don't like it, don't watch. Well, I agree. But if they're using a tragedy, and some comedians do, as part of their act, how arrogant is it to say that people directly involved in that shouldn't have a view on it? And why would you use someone else's pain for your punchlines? I just think that's I think it's nasty. I do not like nasty humour. I have time for edgy and intelligent humour. I don't like nasty humour. And the irony, of course, is that isn't Atkinson. That isn't his type of humour. But I do think his position is kind of arrogant. There should be no taboos. Really, Rowan Atkinson? So you're suggesting that it's perfectly okay for a comedian to take, say, let's take a scenario. Let's say there was people whose child had been kidnapped and murdered. Is Atkinson really saying, oh, it's perfectly fine for some stand-up sleazeball comedian to use that child's death as their punchline, and the parents should be okay with that? So actually, Rowan Atkinson's a smart man, but I don't know how much he's thought this out, because is that really what he's saying? This absolutism? That's my take on it. Um, this is a serious channel, so people might think, "Oh, you're dull. You don't have a sense of humor." I really do, with all the things I've quoted, and there's more. I also quite like some of SNL sketches, not all of them, but quite a bit of them. I do have a sense of humor. I draw a line at. I think there's a difference between intelligent, satirical humor versus nasty, mean humor for the sake of it. To me, that is getting into the realm of bullying and harassment.